We first met Blair a long, long time ago when his then roommate, Jim Olson, hired us at the commission. And Blair looked at us and said, good Lord, what have we gotten into? And we're still here. And in all seriousness, Blair undertook an amazing and exceedingly difficult project with the National Broadband Plan. It was a tremendous, tremendous achievement. And I think if you look at the plan, I've said this publicly, I've said it to Blair, the plan represents some truly, in my mind, it's one of the first times the FCC in a long time has actually sat down and said, let's talk about reasonable expectations of market structure and how do we try to move the ball forward in a constructive and realistic way. And I think the mere fact of that the Commission did that under Blair's leadership is a huge contribution to public policy. Even though the plan may be in beta, and there's a lot of other political stuff at the back of it, I think particularly the stuff up front with the market structure section is really tremendous stuff. They also did a couple models on universal service, and I'm hoping that's going to make a very big contribution as we move forward over the next year. So without further ado, let me give you over to Blair.
Thank you very much. First, let me acknowledge a few folks, Steve Rosenberg in the audience, who contributed an enormous amount to the National Broadband Plan. Of course, Paul DeSalle, who you'll hear from later, and I'm maybe missing some other, John Horrigan in the background.
Kowski's here.
Pardon? Oh, Kowski, that's right, Tom Kowski is here. And I'm sure I'm missing somebody else, but I just want to acknowledge the broadband plan was very much of a team effort, and very grateful for all the members of the team who contributed. So I thought I'd start by talking about something I've never talked about publicly, net neutrality and open internet. This slide has everything I have to say about that topic. And for the rest of my conversation, I'd like to focus on a slightly smaller, more discrete topic which was actually at the heart of what we were doing with the broadband plan, which is this question, which is what is the foundation for national strength in the 21st century? I'd like to start by quoting a guy who's, I think, never been quoted in any FCC order, Peter Drucker, the famous management consultant, talking about the incredible increase in manufacturing productivity in the 20th century, 50-fold, and saying that the same thing had to happen with knowledge workers in the next century. In fact, it goes further to say that it is the increasing the productivity of knowledge work that will determine the success of economies. And that's really the topic I want to talk about today, which is what are the table stakes for the 21st century? And it's my view that high-performance knowledge exchange is the absolute foundation for making sure that America's best days are ahead. Now, it starts, of course, with the work in the plan, where we did a lot of workshops and we had a lot of contributions and we covered a lot of different topics. But I think behind it all, underneath it all, was really one essential challenge, which is how do you get high performance on knowledge exchange? You know, knowledge exchange is simply collecting a lot of data, analyzing it, disseminating it, revising your plan of action based on it, and these constant feedback loops. But it's been totally transformed in the last decade as a result of three technology revolutions, the big data revolution, the computing revolution, and the communications revolution, particularly with broadband and mobile. But I want to emphasize that I'm not talking about just service work and high-tech stuff. Really, every sector, and I've here just listed some traditional sectors of the economy, is being absolutely transformed. And one interesting example, one of the great manufacturing success stories in the United States over the last few years and coming up is Boeing's Dreamliner, which is actually the final construction is being done in Everett, Washington. And it's a great success story for GE as the engine. The Gen X is the fastest selling engine. The Dreamliner is the fastest selling plane of all time. But the number of different countries that different parts are being produced for, this is the future of manufacturing. You're going to have it be done in lots of different places. It cannot be done without a high-performance knowledge exchange foundation. And that foundation is fundamentally what we think of as the broadband ecosystem, which is composed of networks, devices, applications, and above all, and this is really important and often missed, the people who know how to use it. And so the challenge that I think the country has is to make sure that the high-performance knowledge exchange ecosystem is constantly performing at the highest possible level. And in order for that to happen, there has to be two fundamental ideas. Number one, we have to assure that there's a ubiquitous, diverse, and constantly improving ecosystem. And secondly, we should be utilizing that ecosystem to improve how we deliver essential goods and services. That's the two core ideas of the plan, and as I'm going to discuss, it is an absolute conflict with the most prevailing ideas about broadband policy. So what I'm going to do today is first talk about the role of knowledge exchange in the economy and society, then talk about that conflict, and then finally demonstrate how those core ideas play with by talking about what we proposed in the plan on universal service, a topic which I've enjoyed talking about recently, including spending an hour and a half in a hotel room in Las Vegas or a conference room in Las Vegas with 250 rural telephone companies who didn't really like what I had to say, but it was really a lot of fun. So let's talk about knowledge exchange. So we might ask, why do we care about broadband and all? And I want to emphasize that it's not because it's good for puppies, though in fact it is good for puppies. There's this thing called puppy cam, ambient video, one of the most watched uses of the internet. And that's all good, but I don't really care, nor do I think the country should really care about puppy cam, though Mary at Cisco should care because it uses a lot of Cisco products. It's really about the economy, and we know from history that how a society teaches or treats technology has a lot to do with how they go forward. And if you look at the first 5,000 years of human existence, for example, you see that fundamentally population and kind of food growth at the same time, and so this was the so-called Malthusian trap that we would never get out of until, of course, we got to the Industrial Revolution. But within the Industrial Revolution, it's interesting to look at the difference between how France and England treated the process of innovation. For France, it was very much top-down, and the notion was that the king and the royals would determine what science would be done. England had a very different idea, kind of a small d democratic idea, but it required sharing the new intellectual property. And that led to England having a considerably greater GDP growth during those years. And so we want to follow in those footsteps, though it really did something for the entire world as well. But the key to it all was combinatorial innovation, that is to say innovations on top of innovations on top of innovations. And you got that massive increase in the 20th century with manufacturing that Peter Drucker was talking about earlier. And you can't even measure it with numbers because, I mean, if you look at, say, $70,000 in 1900 versus $70,000 now, you'd in some sense much rather have the $2 million that the 70,000 would have given you, but you couldn't buy central air conditioning, you couldn't buy a plane ticket anywhere. So it's really almost unmeasurable what innovation can do. But that innovation that Drucker was talking about is very much dependent upon making sure that the productivity is generated through that interplay of networks, devices, applications, and most of all people, and that's the core to broad economic growth. So in order to have that, you might just say that we need the networks to be constantly improving and widespread and right-sized and people-friendly. But it's not just about the economy, it's also about civic society. If you look at the key functions of a democratic society, some topic that Commissioner Copps is talking about today up in New York, you see the very same element of knowledge exchange. And in fact, if you think about what the platform is, it's going to be exactly the same kind of platform. This is actually a new thing. 100 years ago, the platform for the New York Times would be very different than the platform for the early days of the Ford or General Motors auto company. But today, that platform, the platform of high-performance knowledge exchange, is the essential thing for both. So are we there yet? And the answer is we're far along. We have a lot of the tools in the ecosystem, but they're not widely distributed. But our thought pattern is very far behind. But this is historically similar to what happened with central electricity, where it took nearly 4 decades for 40% of the factories to get central electricity. Part of that had to do with just the sunk cost economics, but a lot of it really had to do with sunk thought. That is, everyone who had ever designed or operated a factory had done it on the basis of water or steam power, and it took a long time to move from thinking about kind of the vertical factory, which was how you had to do it if you were dependent on water power, to the much more effective distributed factory that Henry Ford built at the Rogue River, and which enabled us to build out cars. And so this raises the question of how can we improve the way we deliver essential public goods and services by taking advantage of this revolution. So these are the two core ideas that are behind pretty much everything in the plan, but there's a big problem when we got to policy land. And that's the conflict I want to talk about. Very quickly, there's two rough categories, the ideological and the transactional. The ideological, one from the right, one from the left. You know, it turns out they both ask very good questions and questions we grappled with. And we felt we had a lot of discussions with various folks. And as to the critique on the right, which is why do you need to be involved at all, I think we were able to convince folks, roughly speaking, that there are certain things that only government can do, but that government should do them well. And in that regard, I might note there's a very good reason this argument retains its political currency, which is that most of the current policies are done very, very badly. Well, let's talk about universal service, but the truth is almost every policy we looked at was being done in a very poor manner. So it starts with right ideas and right goals, but you also have to have very effective programs. As to the second question, when we looked at that, and there were some who said we should have much greater levels of government involvement, it turned out that in most parts of the ecosystem, things are actually working reasonably well. There are targeted, necessary government interventions, but you don't need the kind of massive intervention that some folks had thought it. But I do think that both of these views should be respected because they provide both a discipline of thinking about why are we doing certain things or why are we not doing certain things. The real problem is the most prevalent idea, and by prevalent I mean it actually affects the thinking and it certainly affects the way we spend money and resources, and that is that the primary metric for judging the vision of the nation's broadband policy is the speed of the wireline network to the most rural of residents. Now, this is a horrible idea, and we have to get rid of it, and we also, of course, have to have a slide with the vampire in it, because every media presentation needs a vampire. But I really do think that if there's one thing I'd like us to do, it's to get rid of this idea, because it contains so many bad sub-ideas. And I'm going to quickly go through those bad and good ideas. The first bad idea is to focus on the primary metric as opposed to an ecosystem. You might ask the question, what would you prefer, great hammer, no nails, no blueprint? Great nail, no hammer or blueprint? Great blueprint, no hammer or nails? The answer, of course, is actually none of them, because it would give you this. What we need is a policy to drive each element to constantly improve. The networks lead to better devices, leading to better applications. We need diversity within each category, because that is what drives innovation, that's what drives growth. And above all, we need people who know how to use it effectively. The second one is it's about one input speed, when in fact speed matters, but it really should be about the output, which is the way people use it. First of all, speed's not the only important characteristic. Secondly, the bigger upside, on the left you have these key sectors, which are billions and billions of dollars. Then you have the rural sector. The incremental benefit of the fixed speed to residential areas is highly uncertain, actually. In fact, one of the studies we did during the broadband plan had consumers recognizing going from narrowband to broadband was very important. Going from broadband to ultra broadband, not so clear. Similarly, if you look across a lot of different countries, you don't see consumers rushing to the highest speed levels. But we know applications can drive savings in healthcare, in education and job training, as well as in government services. The third idea, it's all about wired. It really needs to be about both mobile and wired. For one thing, mobile is already starting to do a lot of the things that wired traditionally has only been able to do. We know that mobile, in the next few years, will exceed fixed as the primary way people access the internet. Probably most important from the economy's point of view, the changes in mobile broadband are horizon industry, by which I mean they are where all industries are moving toward. So if you're in the construction industry, you are moving in a direction that mobile is going to allow you to do. If you're in retail, if you're in transportation, any industry, all industries are going to be dramatically transformed by higher speeds in mobile. It's also, by the way, important for security purposes, often overlooked, though I've had some interesting meetings with some generals recently talking about this. It's absolutely essential that the United States, for security reasons, stay ahead on all kind of new spectrum technologies. The fourth bad idea, it's all about rural. It's really about right size to all areas. I'm not going to go too much into this right now, but most of the arguments for why we need to spend billions of dollars to support rural and not on other things actually don't hold up when they go through an economic or social justice argument. I'm obviously not expecting you to read this, but I highly recommend it at some point, which was a November editorial, very well written. The head of the Iowa Telecom Association attacking the broadband plan for a number of different things, all of which, by the way, he's wrong about. But nonetheless, it's a great representation of the point of view that is predominant actually in this. The one point I want to talk about is it's hard to believe, but the FCC does not believe all Iowans should have access to the same type of broadband speeds. This sounds really great. It's phenomenally wrong. Phenomenally wrong. First of all, it's markets, not the governments, that determine the speed. Secondly, the policies that he recommends will condemn a number of areas in Iowa to having no broadband whatsoever. Third, the policy he recommends would result in every subscriber to the network paying $30 a month, which would drive tens of millions of people off the network because they couldn't afford it. But I want to point out a different issue as well, which is this is a recipe for a stagnant economy. If you have everybody getting exactly equal, you're not going to get the kind of innovation that you need that we talked about earlier. What you really want is for the advanced users who need more bandwidth to get that bandwidth. Because that's where the innovations are going to drive, and then eventually, of course, it moves down or moves to other markets. We've seen that throughout. We don't want everyone to have, first of all, it is the market that's setting it, but it actually would be bad for the economy if that was our goal. And this feeds right into the final really bad idea, which is it's about the residential market. It really should be about strategic markets. We want to make sure that we as a country have the kind of bandwidth we need to do the kinds of things we do, and we should focus on making sure that happens. And I would just point out very quickly that the business use of this high-performance knowledge exchange platform is much more significant from a dollar perspective than the commerce market. So as a consequence of these bad ideas, we do a lot of dumb things. For example, we spend $17,000 per line in support of a home, a single home. We don't fund high-cost wireless, which may be, in fact, more important in certain high-cost areas. We still don't have an interoperable public safety network, for example. We're focused on the wrong things. So again, these are the right ideas that I think really ought to drive the policy. So let me just now focus for a few more minutes on talking about one example, though I could do this really with any of these issues which we covered in the plan. Like I said, you can have the right vision and the right ideas, but if you have an ineffective program, it's going to be very bad. And some of the key things for effective programs I've listed here. Here's how we applied those core ideas to universal service reform. And it really is about reprioritizing what we're doing, as well as doing certain things like creating a space for experimentation. I would start by just pointing out that we spend a lot of money, but we're not spending it on the gaps that we identified, and we're not spending it in effective ways. The key questions for reforming USF, questions that we answered, what levels should be subsidized, what's the size of the unserved home, what's the size of the private investment gap. One of the things that was really phenomenal, by the way, was if you would ask these questions, which are just core basic questions, of anyone at the FCC before we got there. In particular, I want to congratulate Steve Rosenberg, who this is a summary of a fantastic 137-page technical appendix that he had the principal responsibility for writing. Actually, all of the answers people at the FCC would have given you would have been completely wrong. It is phenomenal that for years everyone's been debating these issues without any kind of concept of what the real numbers were. And one of the most interesting things that Steve discovered was that when we look at the private investment gap, 4% of the unserved would be approximately 60% of the cost. Which, by the way, in the plan, we just basically said, let's not worry about that. Let's solve 96% of the problem. Which we thought, that's a pretty good thing to do. And by the way, it's actually quite solvable. So there's this criticism the subsidized speeds are too slow, but the critics never address how they would pay for increasing the speed. Also, we don't know what the incremental benefit of going from, say, 4 to 6 would actually be. But also the critics ignore the fact, and this is really important, that if you actually look at the universal target as opposed to the publicized target, the universal target of the United States is in fact fairly aggressive. Again, I think it's really important that we have far more aggressive targets for other sectors of the economy, but in terms of this universalization goal, it is not, in fact, way behind. The second most common criticism, which it kind of is technical, but very, very important, which is a lot of small rural phone companies think we should not get rid of rate of return regulation. Now, I raised this question with the group in Las Vegas, which is, should the government ever use its power to assess consumers to assure the permanent profitability of a private company? I said, does anyone here believe that is a good idea? And none of them raised their hands. And so I said, well, look, great, then we're all in agreement. And they, of course, said, what are you talking about? And I said, rate of return regulation. And they said, oh, no, we didn't mean that. It was a really wonderful debate after that. They said, for example, rate of return isn't a guarantee, it's an opportunity. I said, this reminds me of John Mitchell and the moral obligation bonds, which the government may or may not pay back. Anyway, this is a profoundly bad philosophical idea. It's also a bad economic idea. I want to emphasize that, adoption actually is a really important issue. I think it's a short-term issue. I think we ought to treat it like a short-term issue, but a very serious one. We need to get everybody with the tools to be able to do it. I would note that in a lot of discussions, what I think of as a bad idea is when people only talk about price and not value. That's a big mistake. I think it's also important to have a high-cost mobility fund. What the size of that should be, I think, is uncertain. Mobile is going to build out far more significantly than the fixed side. But we need to make sure that really all the country is covered. And again, I think there are certain targets for experimentation that need to be done. Particularly, I do think it's important we get it gigged to all communities, but I think we need to experiment about how we do that. Adoption clearly requires some experimentation before we go full board into it. And then finally, I actually think we should do a small program where we give kind of a race to the top for economic development. So how does USF Reform serve those high-performance knowledge exchange goals? They absolutely match up. That is precisely what we were trying to do. We're trying to make sure that USF serves the goal of the ubiquitous, diverse, constantly improving ecosystem and improves processes. Let me just also note that all of the national purposes, the last half of the plan, which I think 10 years from now may turn out to be the most important part of it, is really about improving the processes. One that I'll just note, first of all, I'll note again Peter Drucker, because he really was smart. The most important area for developing new concepts, methods, and practices will be the management of society's knowledge resources, specifically education and healthcare, both of which today are over-administered and undermanaged. We certainly saw that. I think that the high-performance knowledge exchange platform gives us an opportunity to really dramatically change that. I'll use one example, which is a better platform. The one that Gutenberg developed 500 years ago, or the one that is being developed now for delivering educational content to our kids. There's no question that the one that's being developed now is much better for a variety of reasons. I'd note that the Department of Education said a very similar thing in their technology plan that came out last month. The fact that it was written by the same guy who wrote our education chapter, completely coincidental. And secondly, the Governor Bush and Wise Commission on Digital Content came out with a report yesterday saying the same things, which is we really need to get rid of we need to get rid of textbooks, replace them with digital devices because of their improved functionality and dynamic capability. So, closing, what are the table stakes? Again, it's really this ubiquitous, diverse, constantly improving ecosystem of network devices, applications, and people, along with using those tools to rethink the way we deliver essential public goods and services. That would give us that high-performance knowledge exchange. That would give us at least the foundation, without which, if we don't have this, there's no way we can have a strong economy or a strong civic society. Let me close by, again, quoting Drucker, "The danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence. It is to act with yesterday's logic." I would argue that most of the policies we looked at the FCC, we were acting with yesterday's logic. It's time to change that. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Blair?
Someone must want to defend the rural phone companies. Come on.
Or the broadcasters. Blair's.
Or the broadcasters. I didn't talk about Spectrum. I could easily talk about that as well.
I have a question.
Sure.
All the policies we've got, or most of them, say, are pretty bad.
No, I don't think the policies are bad. I think they implement the programs to implement the... How do you fix it? Well, first of all, you have to have the right idea. You have to know what you're doing. And I think that what we were trying to do in the broadband plan, part of what I'm actually doing here is I think that a mistake that we made was when the plan rolled out, it was rolled out with reference to very specific programmatic ideas, and not enough time was spent saying, look, this is the vision that we really need to address. This is what's going on in the world economy for why we need to do this. I think there was way too much either too general in terms of broadband is good, which is actually not the point, or too specific in terms of we need to change a specific policy this way. So the first thing is to get the right idea. What are we trying to accomplish? And again, I think it's that ubiquitous, diverse, constantly improving ecosystem, as well as changing the processes by which we think about how we deliver these essential public goods and services. But the second thing then is to, it's just the art of running the agency. I think one of the best things Congress ever did in the implementation of the 96 Act, which I have to say as the chief of staff at the time, I hated, turned out to be really good. Congress gave us a timetable. Said, you do these things on this timetable. By the way, my Republican staffer friends told me they never thought we'd actually hit that timetable. They wanted us to fail. That's why they had really tight timetables. But we nonetheless hit them. And Reed deserves the lion's share of the credit, but there were people like Richard Metzger and others who, I think we had our heating bill in the month of April of 96 was $450,000 above the normal because we were working 24/7. But it did focus attention, and we just got it done. By the way, I'm not saying we got everything done right. If we'd had more time, we might have been slightly more accurate. But my experience in government is much better to say get it 80% right in 20% of the time than to try to get it 100% right in 500% of the time. Because in truth, there are a lot of self-correcting mechanisms, courts, Congress, other things. So I think that, all of these things, particularly on universal service and spectrum reform, just go do them. Any other questions?
What's your thought about
go ahead.
FCC? Oh, sorry.
Yep, I'm always curious where people get this $30, a month kind of. You said that thousands of people would go off the system if it was mentioned in the Iowa editorial because it would raise it. I've never found an internet access plan unless you're talking about dial-up. It's less than $30 or $40. So. No,
I think that's that's right, but that's not the point. First of all, where I get it from is...
If it went to $30.
No, not that if it goes to $30. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. So in the plan, what he says is the plan calls for 100 megs to 100 million homes, which, by the way, I think the market's going to drive toward. That's the market doing that. In order for government to subsidize in areas that aren't going to get that, and Columbia did a study that said, you're going to get it to so many homes. In order to do that, and we laid this out in September, very early on, it would be, Steve, correct me if I got this wrong, in excess of 300 million, I think it was about 330. I don't know that number is 100, it's close to accurate. People challenge it a little bit on the margins, but that's about the right number. In order to fund that through the current system, you would have to add $30 a month. So it's not $30 a month, it's $30 on top of what you're doing. And I don't, John would know this number better than me, but that would cause tens of millions of people to have to probably get off the system.
One quick question, and we got to move it.
So, jobs. Other than the interesting idea proposed earlier about getting rid of backhoes, do you have any suggestions for how FCC policy or thinking can meet the real need these days for increased employment?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to understand what we can know and what we can't know. The broadband ecosystem is what economists refer to as general purpose technology. Those are very hard to measure. Electricity was a version of that. There are other things that are general purpose technologies, particularly in the early days of a general purpose technology. We tend to measure the wrong things. There was a great essay by a Stanford professor, Paul David, called The Computer and the Dynamo, talking about the computer stuff. And 2 points. One was there's always a diffusion lag, and that's where the electrical data comes from. It's also, by the way, we're seeing that kind of in broadband and in some other ways. But there's also a measurement gap, which is you measure the wrong thing for a number of years. My point, and you see this if you look at the Dreamliner or you look at what's going on in a variety of different places, is this is the table stakes. You're not going to have a job engine in this economy, in an interconnected global economy, unless you have certain kinds of functions of networks, devices, applications, and above all, the people who know how to use them. So I can't measure it and say that if the FCC does X, it'll create X number of jobs. But I can certainly say if we don't do the kinds of things we're talking about here, we will fall behind. And one other point to that, the single most important thing the federal government can do is get spectrum out. Every time new spectrum comes out, there's innovation, there's job growth, there's construction. It is unfortunate, in my view, that the D block, that we are not moving rapidly toward the auction of that, because I think that'd be the single biggest thing. But the reason we emphasize spectrum so much in the plan is because, in terms of innovation and job growth, that's really critical. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Blair.